our Old Testament pretty soon. We're still in some of the prophets. If you've been following along in the book of Story, we're in chapter 18 or 19, I think. This is our 19th series here, and if it continues on schedule here, we're going to be looking at the Christmas story in the month of July, so that be something we haven't done, but we're going through this in this chronological order. And the last few weeks we looked a lot at the prophets. We talked about Elijah, we talked about Isaiah, talked about Jeremiah, and this week we're in the book of Daniel. Now, thank goodness I'm not going to try to be a prophet and try to interpret all the prophecies in there like some preachers do. But what we're going to do is focus on the king that's the king of Babylon during this time of Daniel, and that's the king by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, probably not as familiar with him as some of the other kings, but we do have something in common, and that's what we're going to look at as I give it to your outline. So basically, in your Bibles, if you have that, we're going to look at Daniel chapter 4 and talk about this almost a narcissist named Nebuchadnezzar. Back in 1964, there was a book out called The Three Christ of Ypsilanti. Yeah, I said that right. Ypsilanti, which was a psychiatric case study done in Ypsilanti, Michigan. So hopefully that's the last time I'll ever have to say that in my lifetime. But the study is a psychiatric case study done in that town. And there Dr. Milton Rokeach had 3 patients that had a mental disorder. And they had these illusions of grandeur that's not uncommon in the case of mental disorder. But these 3 patients all thought that they were God. They had a Messiah complex. And they would tell everyone that they indeed were God. They thought they were God in the flesh. So they kind of took this Messiah complex to a whole new level. And so he got, this Dr. Rokeach decided to get all 3 of these guys together, whose name was Leon, Clyde, and Joseph. Not great names for God, but he thought, I'm going to try to help y'all understand what is real and what is not. And so he's trying to figure out how he can make these guys get in touch with reality. And one of his strategies was, somehow he convinced them, don't know how he did that, was to have these 3 men spend 2 years together just sharing life. So these 3 guys, all who equally thought they were God, he had them sleep in the same room, eat from the same table, and they would have group sessions together. Can you imagine the discussions? Can you imagine the feedback? Tell me how you feel today. Back and forth. And so his hopes were that the other 2 people who claimed to be God would somehow realize, oh, wait a minute. If he thinks they're God, it can't be all 3 of us. And as a result, it didn't have quite the conclusion that he wanted, because it's all quite confusion. I mean, think of the group therapy where, one would say, well, I've been sent here by God to save the earth. I am the Messiah. And the doctor would say, well, how do you know that? And the guy would say, well, God told me. And somebody else in the room said, I didn't tell you that. Can you imagine that going back and forth there? And so it was a state of confusion because they were living in an alternate reality where they thought the whole universe was about them and that they had created the universe. They thought they were the center of the universe. Very sad disorder. And I'm thinking, well, my goodness, if that's what it takes to be crazy, so all of us would have to maybe check in from time to time. Because isn't that the definition of the way some people live? That we think that it's all about us. All my decisions are based on what I think about God, what I think about reality. And sometimes people think, I'm in charge here, until God humbles them. And God will humble us through amazing tragedies, life event changes. As we look at Daniel chapter 4, King Nebuchadnezzar is a case study on what it's like for somebody to think they are God. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar thought. I'm in charge. He was sort of like, who's the guy that they say just kind of orchestrates all the bad? George Soros. You ever heard his name mentioned there? He's actually quoted saying, I am God. So he has a God complex there to give you a little bit about modern day thinking. And even though in the past weeks we looked at idolatry, and idolatry simply putting anything in God's place in our life. And we talked about last week, that's not antiquated. It's not from years ago. We may not have golden images or idols in our living room, but we've replaced other things, whether it's money or power, success, entertainment, food. Lots of people choose things that think, this is all that matters. This is the center of my universe. The list just goes on and on. But as we look at this today, the foundation of each of all false God is what? Me. How many decisions are based on, this is what I think? What are all the arguments that you see in social media and politics today? How dare you think of anything besides what I think? And if you stop and look at that, people are deciding I'm in control. Nobody steps back and says, well, let's see what God thinks. What does God have to say? And God's word is always a blueprint. There's not another thing in the world that we do without going to a blueprint. When an automaker makes a car, it starts with a blueprint on the drawing board. When a farmer plants his harvest in the field, there's a blueprint there. If I prepare my soil correctly, if I plant the seeds correctly, if I get it all right, and God compliments me with sun and right amount of rain and the like, this will grow. Everything starts with a blueprint of an idea. And so when people build their success on anything but God, that's the problem. And somebody said, well, I'm in charge of my company. I'm the CEO. I'm chairman of the board. Well, God likes to be in that boardroom there. And so the first course of action is, God, are you in charge and you're just using me? Well, as we study the Old Testament, God takes seriously somebody who puts somebody else in his place. That's what we've seen with the prophets of Baal and Elijah. God says, don't do that. Nebuchadnezzar is a man who thought of himself as God. And remember, the nation of Israel has been split into two kingdoms. You got the northern kingdom, devastated, destroyed by the Assyrians. And now the southern kingdom is wiped out by the Babylonians and King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, when Nebuchadnezzar comes in to the nation that he's conquered, one of the things that he does is he wants to take the brightest and the sharpest from the land and bring them in as his personal attendants, really slaves. One of those is Daniel. That's the whole story of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar chooses him. So, I like you. And there were many others with Daniel. And so Daniel's probably, 15, 16 years old now. Sharp, smart. And he now goes to serve this foreign king of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Nebuchadnezzar at this time is the man who had all the power in the Mediterranean world. No one was more feared than him, basically because he was full of himself. I mean, if you dared to go against him, boy, you'd be shaking in your sandals. Because nobody dared go against him. Now, there's also a prophet during this time, and the prophet this time is Ezekiel. Remember, we've looked at Jeremiah and Isaiah and Elijah and the like. Well, Ezekiel is a contemporary of Daniel. And Ezekiel paints a picture of what it's like to replace God in our life. And Ezekiel's message is pretty much like, you are not a God. You are not replacing God on his throne. You're a mere mortal. Nebuchadnezzar didn't want to accept that. And Ezekiel has said, you got to learn that there is a God, but you're not him. Now, in modern day, that could be a politician, that could be an entertainer. Have you seen interviews where people say they're just so full of themselves, and they never say, well, I'm just an instrument, God's using me. Like, again, it doesn't matter whether we're a nurse, doctor, mechanic, farmer. You say, God's just using me to work the farm. God's just using me as mechanic, as a doctor, as whatever that you choose there. There is a God and we are not God. That's what Ezekiel starts preaching to Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar now is going to learn that lesson firsthand, because he has a pure narcissistic tendency of I'm all about self. It's all about me. There was a psychological test given for decades called the Narcissistic Personality Inventory. I don't know if you've ever dealt with a narcissist. In Virginia Beach, I was unfortunate to hire, came glowing recommendation, hired, I think he was living in Arizona at the time. Oh, we needed an associate of special qualities there, and our church was growing. And so we hired him, and it wasn't 6 months into it. I thought, what a mistake we've made. Because it was all about him, every decision he made. And you would call on him, and he said, no, it's not about me. I'm like, it is. And I remember when that first came to light, his daughter, which was a sweetheart of a young lady, she went to the doctor and had some nodules on her throat. And we got word about it, and so me and one of my other associates, we were going to go by and meet with them, have prayer. And we got there, and his wife and daughter, wipers at the door, and said, come on, she's in here. And I said, where's Steve? Oh, he's gone to the doctor. Well, what's wrong with him? Well, he got thinking maybe he has some nodules on his throat. I'm like, are you kidding me? I mean, that was his thought. Oh, she's got the most devastating news a young 18-year-old girl, can hear. And he thought, no, I got to go check and see if I got. That's when I clicked. Oh my goodness, you are all about you. And of course, I'm sorry to say, it went long before we had to let him go because it was affecting his ministry and his just approach to life. And I just missed all those signals. But this was a test called the NPI, Narcissistic Personality Inventory. And psychologists over the years realized that as the years went on, there was a huge increase on the score. And here's the way it worked. They were given comments that they had to respond to. They had to agree or disagree with it on a scale of 1 to 5. Very basic personality test. So one of the comments were like, if I ruled the world, it would be a better place. And they were asked to score that on a scale of 1 to 5. I think I'm a special person. I think I'm a great person. Scale it 1 to 5. I can live any way I want. No one has the right to tell me. Scale that on 1 to 5. I can be anything I want to be because I'm important. Scale that on 1 to 5. And they had this huge increase because the mentality score was, it's all about me. Do you remember, I was in youth ministry when this song hit the pop chart. Billy Joel, This Is My Life. Remember that song? This is my life. You're not going to tell me when to come home. And I remember hearing, and the kids, oh, what a great Billy Joel song. I said, that's a horrible song. Because he was teaching through music, it's all about him. And one of the psychologists in the study at San Diego State University, it said that the problem we have is that we're raising our children in an environment where we tell them they're special. Well, that sounds okay. Well, we want to make our kids feel special. He said, but we tell them they're special, but we don't teach them about their shared responsibility to other people. And if you don't do that, what happens? It's all about me. You live in a world where you're special and you have no responsibility to people. And if you think about it, a lot of people weigh in when we have these mass shootings. My goodness, we seem to have so many of them. And a lot of it will go back to the fact, what did this person think? It's all about me. And anytime a person does killing, whether it's one person or 20, almost always is they see no value in life. It's all about me. I got to kill as many people as I can. And then it always goes back to, well, bless his heart, he couldn't help it. And it's just not true. No regard for the value of human life. That was Nebuchadnezzar's favorite song. He sang it all day long. It's all about me. I'm special. Look at me. And so now he's the king of Babylon. And geographically, if you look at Babylon during that day, it's basically modern day Iraq, to give you kind of an understanding there. Now here's what's interesting. When you and I think of Iraq, what's the name that comes to our mind? Saddam Hussein. Remember that horrible story? I bet you this was so interesting to me. That's why I love reading about history. The nickname that Saddam Hussein gave himself was, guess what? Successor to Nebuchadnezzar. because he knew the history of the region. It was Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was a self-centered narcissist, but that's the mantle he wanted to wear, successor to Nebuchadnezzar. Never heard that on CNN, did you? That's not going to be a lead story. So these guys had a lot in common. And in Jeremiah, we read about King Nebuchadnezzar. He captured the king of Judah. He captured the king of Judah's family. And this is how evil this guy was, right up there with Saddam Hussein. He plucked out the eyes of the king so that the last image ingrained on his brain would be the brutal death of his family. So he killed his family, I'm sorry, I've done my turn. He killed his family in front of him and then plucked his eyes out. So the last thing he saw was the murder of his family. And then another place you read about it where he roasted another king of Judah over fire. This is an evil tyrant, Saddam Hussein, same evil tyrant. And so over and over you read where Nebuchadnezzar had this self-centeredness. But then in Daniel chapter 4, something happens. So Jeremiah 37, we read about this evil Nebuchadnezzar. He takes over Babylon. But look at what in Daniel chapter 4, and I think I've got this on your outline. Here's what Nebuchadnezzar writes. Now this is, based on what I've just told you, here's the contrast. To the nations and people of every language who live on the earth, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. You know what that sounds like? That sounds like a worship song. Think about that. Oh God, how great you are. Our God is an awesome God. Well, something happened. What happened that transformed this guy plucking out the eyes of a king and roasted another king over an open fire? I mean, that would be like waking up and listening to the radio and Howard Stern giving a personal testimony on Jesus. I mean, that's the way I would look at it. There's got to be a backstory. It just doesn't match up here. So what happens is, Nebuchadnezzar is telling what happened in his life, and he's talking about a very painful lesson. And in verse 4 of chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar tells this story of being at home. He's content, he's prosperous, doesn't have a lot to fear because remember, he's the center of the universe, surrounded by an army. He has over a 600,000 square foot palace, and the real God of the universe decides to pay him a visit. And here's the dream that we learn about in chapter 4. Boy, it's painful. I'm sorry. Oh, my goodness. So here's what we start about in verse 4. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid. As I was lying in bed, listen to this, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. You ever woke up from a dream and thought, what in the world was that? What did that mean? I don't have a lot of terrifying dreams, but that is on the top of my list when I get to heaven. Why did you give me all these dreams that didn't make any sense? So that's what he means when it said pass through his mind. He dreams of this tree, this huge, beautiful tree that is plentiful, and it shelters birds and beasts. And then in verse 13, look when you outline, this is what he says here. In the visions I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there was before me a holy one, a messenger, coming down from heaven, and he called to me in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim the branches. Strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. Now 7 times is probably a metaphor for years. That word 7 also means complete. So Nebuchadnezzar knows this dream is not good. And it's like waking up and you, I don't know, had bad pizza the night before or something. you just wake up and say, man, what does that dream mean? So Daniel, remember he's the exile from Jerusalem, he's brought in to hear the dream. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar has brought in his court magicians, his interpreters, and nobody knows what it means. And then somehow says, well, Daniel, he's a pretty good interpreter. And Daniel hears the dream, and Nebuchadnezzar can tell that Daniel is upset by it. And Daniel says, well, don't let this bother you. It's all right. And Nebuchadnezzar says, what are you talking about? And so he gives him the dream there, and Daniel pretty much talks to him about how he's going to be driven away by the people, he's going to be living with animals, and pretty much says, you're not going to be in charge anymore. You're going to be introduced to the living God, the true living God. And when you figure that out, here's what's going to happen. You're going to be disposed. Well, Nebuchadnezzar hears this and he blows it off. You're crazy. That's what a narcissist does. There's no way that you're going to interpret that. So, the couple of points that I've got for you on the outline there. Few questions about Nebuchadnezzar's life that we can personalize. And question number one is, what's my motivation? Why do we do what we do? Think about that. What is the reason I get up and do what I do? You see, for Nebuchadnezzar, his whole life was motivated by his own glory. I got to impress other people. It's all about me. And I don't know if he had political spinsters like politicians do today, but pretty much they give him what to say. But in Daniel chapter 3, we read about that Nebuchadnezzar has put up this huge statue. Now, I don't know what the statue was. I don't know if it's an image of himself or another idol. But pretty much if you went by that statue and you didn't bow down to it, you're going to die. That's what got Daniel in trouble here. And so he was desperate to impress people. And for many of us, we do that. Think about something you do that's just not all about you. When's the last time we stepped back and said, I got to do things that are not about me? It's so hard to do that because whether we buy into it or not, we live in that kind of a world. It just centers around us. And when we step back and say, I want to do this for somebody else, people take notice of this. Man, what are you doing? Because that stands out. So we don't use the language, but sometimes say, this is my reason for doing this. Well, there's a second question. What's the source of my strength? What's the source of my success there? Because if you look at Nebuchadnezzar's life, he gave all the credit for his success to himself. It's all about me. Look what I've done. Verse 30, he says, by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesties. Remember, we read that earlier, but it was the opposite. But before that, before he had this dream, he's like, it's all about me. It's all about my majesty. And so there's so many things that we're reminded from time outside of our hands. What does it take to humble us sometimes? Say, you know what, it's not about me. What does insurance companies use a lot? Like when the hailstorm came through and wind and there's damage. What's the phrase that the insurance company uses? Act of God. You ever wonder, what does that mean? That means it was out of your control. You can't control the wind. You can't control the storm, the rain, and whatever. And they call it an act of God. It's actually written into the policy. I sold insurance for a while, and so I know it's there. And so sometimes we get comfortable and say, oh, that's right, it's an act of God. But we don't do that with our own life there. And because we know I've worked hard to achieve what I've got, and sometimes it's hard to step back and give God the credit. Now, Habakkuk, who's another prophet, he put it this way in one of his verses. He says, talking about how people act, he said, they sweep past like the wind, and they go on, here you go, whose own strength is their God. They depend on their self there. And so that's what Nebuchadnezzar is doing right here. And he says, you know what? You may appear that you're in charge, but something happens from time to time that humbles us. I mean, Rex's granddaughter is a perfect example. We go along and all of a sudden, what a beautiful event of having a grandbaby born. And all of a sudden the doctor says, but there's a problem. Boy, what do you do? We just get humble and say, oh my goodness, I'm not in charge. Because we got to find somebody who is. We got to find a surgeon who has the expertise to take a small baby like that and extract a tumor from it. That's when we were like, oh, we're not in charge. But so many times we get right back into it. So we got to find out what we're chasing. That's number 3. What's the purpose of my life? What is it I'm really chasing here? What is it that I'm going after that really makes me happy? I read this story years ago about a 26-year-old lady named Katie Kane. Katie Kane had a disorder that causes her to never feel full. She was always hungry, not just a little bit hungry, but she constantly had hunger pains. And by the time she was 3 years old, she weighed 50 pounds. By the time she was 20, she weighed 300 pounds. Because she never felt full, even though she ate. Didn't matter what she ate. She had hunger pains. And it's a dangerous disorder, and it's called the Prader-Willi syndrome. Prader-Willi syndrome, and it affects 20,000 people in the world, and it simply means no matter how much you eat, you never feel full, and you got to eat again. You could eat a full meal, and you say, I got to eat again, and that's what causes the weight gain. And it says there's a gene missing from the chromosome of these people that causes you to feel full, and so you eat, and you eat, and you eat, and you still feel like you're starving. She was fired from jobs. She was arrested for stealing things like candy bars, because she just had to have it. And it left her on her own with food, and she literally ate herself to death because the hunger just wouldn't go away. And I thought about that. How many people are like that? We just strive, not that we have that same disease, but it's a disorder that we say, I got to have more, I got to have this. And how many people say, I got it? How many people win the lottery? Say, oh, I finally got the millions of dollars I always wanted. How many stories have we heard about them later where they just blew it? They end up in jail or whatever because it really didn't satisfy him. That's Nebuchadnezzar's story. He's headed for this encounter, and he says, I got everything I need. I got a 600,000 square foot palace. I got all the money in the world. And then Daniel says, but you're not going to hear this in this dream, but it's not about you anymore. And that's Nebuchadnezzar's lesson there. And he tells him, please accept my advice. And he pretty much tells him that, the tree's going to be stripped away. You're not going to be in charge anymore. And you're going to be sleeping under the stars. You're not going to be clean anymore. You're not going to have manicured nails. It's going to be terrible. And verse 34, here's what Nebuchadnezzar says. My sanity was restored. And so it's like he came to a realization there. He realized that his strength was not his own. And the more he pursued life in this way, it did not satisfy him. What does Solomon say in Ecclesiastes? I'm chasing all this stuff, and it does not satisfy. Kyle Idleman took over at the Southeast Christian Church with Bob Russell. And he's written many books there, but he tells a great story in one of his books there. I cannot recall which one there. But he talks about on a certain Friday night of the week, and this is his word saying, he was asked to speak at a Kentucky State Penitentiary to a group of inmates there. And he said, boy, what an interesting group. He said, I've been asked to go before. He said, I actually enjoy going and speaking in different prisons because I have a captive audience. They're not there to judge me. He says, you go in there and you've got guys who can teach us a lot about authenticity because guess what? They all know they're guilty. He said, they come in there. First of all, they're all dressed alike. He said, you really can't impress people with your wardrobe. He said, I don't wear a suit, coat and tie. I wear jeans and a regular shirt there. He said, but there's a level of transparency among these inmates that I often long for the church. If we just come in and are real for a moment. He said, so we talked a little bit about God's love. He said, easy topics because they were just hungry for anything. So I talk about God's love and I talk about God's grace. He said, and then I stayed afterwards for a few minutes. And I was always talking to some of the different inmates. One of the inmates came up to me and he showed me his Bible and a picture of his family in the Bible. And here's what he said. I tried my way and it didn't work. So now I'm going to do things his way. And then he added, I just wish it didn't take being sent here for me to put him in charge. Boy, what a great sermon. An inmate could get up and say that. We could just have amen, go home, couldn't we? I wish it didn't take being sent here for me to put him in charge. And Idleman says this, I didn't know his name, but I looked down at his name tag to make sure I wasn't talking to King Nebuchadnezzar. Because that's what makes people fail. It's all about me. He said, but it didn't work. He said, this was his story. He tried it his way, it didn't work. So now I'm going to do it his way. That's where Nebuchadnezzar got to. He tried it every way possible. And you and I get to a point where we say, I just can't fix this anymore. There's certain pieces of life I can't put together. And whether it's a health tragedy, whatever it is in life that just puts us on what is it that makes us stop and say, oh my goodness, I'm not in charge of it. I'm not in charge anymore. That's why stories about King Nebuchadnezzar are here. And that's why it may not take a dream for us to realize that. But it does take some Daniels in our life, just to say. And the Daniel in our life could be the life-turning event, the life-changing event. Say, wait a minute, do you realize that this happened because you're not in charge? And the premise comes, and these people say, well, I need to go to church for anyway. It's because we get a foundation. We build a foundation with stories like this. We build up our faith. We build up our trust. We learn about God's love and mercy. And then when it hits, what happens? Oh, man, I'm so glad I know about God. Because I've been asked this question in all my years of ministry. What do people do who don't have God to lean on? What do they do when their life gets turned upside down? And again, being in the funeral business, I get asked to do a lot of funerals. People have no contact with the church, no contact with ministry. Would you just please come and do the service? And I have to really search hard for what to say because they don't have a foundation. King Nebuchadnezzar teaches us. He did it his way. Daniel says, you're going to lose it if you don't turn away. And Nebuchadnezzar did, and he gave it to God. May that be our challenge in whatever small, large event going on in our life. God is on the throne, we're not. And it's not about me. It never has been. It's all about God. Let's pray. God, I'm so grateful for the lessons you teach us. And Father, we don't spend a lot of time in your Old Testament word, but I'm so grateful there's stories there that just make us take a step back and say, wow, that's why that story is there. And I thank you for the clarity that you give us. And I'm thankful that we can learn from stories hundreds and hundreds of years ago that teach us about you are the God that we need to serve. And I pray, Father, that you'll keep us humble in our own small ways, in our own small little corner of the world. Help us always to understand that and take a step back from life and say, God, I'm glad you're in charge. Keep me focused on you that I may never turn my back on you. God, we love you for the way that you take care of us, and I pray that you will continue your blessings upon us as we go upon our life in the days and weeks to come. Father, thank you for the gift of Jesus, and it's through his name that we come to you with all these requests and all these blessings. It's in his name. Amen. Thank you for letting me suffer through that with you. If I said anything